All right.
How do you know that?
Yeah, well,
All is right.
It's a doxa. Oh, wait a second. I said this was a doxa-free zone. I take that back. That's great. All right. Well, I am Brandon Gill. I am a professor at the University of South Florida, and I'm the academic director of our Doctor of Business Administration program, which is a program for working executives. We have one of my students here, Emilio. We'll probably have a couple more coming over the course of the conference, but...
Who is this student? I'm sorry for that.
Yeah. But
I feel your feelings.
for many years, I've been doing workshops here on the use of case studies in education. And this year, when Najib asked me if I wanted to do a workshop, what I thought I would try is something a little bit different. And what I wanted to do was to lay out some theories that I've been thinking about for a very long time, and then use this audience as a source of practical examples.
May I make an interruption? Any person that is in both segments of the workshop will have a certificate as usual. Same thing with the other workshop. So workshop has certificates.
But, thank you. So, at any rate, the idea then is in the first half of the workshop, I will present my perspective on how complexity is changing the way, changing the skill set that our students need to be effective in the workforce and in society. Then, in the second half of the workshop, which will occur after lunch, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be looking for examples from all of you of innovative ways that you have incorporated these skills. And to add to my motivation, tomorrow morning, I'm doing a plenary presentation at breakfast, and the plan is that I will use the examples that you gave me. So if you leave me without examples, it's going to be a very embarrassing plenary session, which would probably be good for a laugh, but nevertheless, I would prefer to have a rich set of examples to work with. So, the title of the presentation is How Growing Complexity is Changing the Skills That Our Students Need and How We Need to Adapt as Educators. Because I believe it is a mistake to believe that our students are going to adapt to the way we teach and the way we instruct. Our job is to find ways that will resonate with them. Now, the focus of the presentation is the first thing I am going to do is define what I mean by task complexity. And let me tell you, task complexity is a term that is so poorly defined in the literature, and there are so many different variations, that if I don't explain what I mean, you're never going to be able to figure out what I'm talking about. Once I have talked about task complexity and why I believe the nature of the tasks that our students today are facing is fundamentally changed, certainly from the time when I was being educated in the 1960s, and it's totally different from the way we were educating students 100 years ago, even though in many cases our techniques have not changed at all. So I'm going to talk about the different skill sets that we need to cope with today's complexity, and then finally, we'll have the conversation after lunch about how we can innovate to help students acquire this particular set of skills. With that, let me just move forward. So I'll start by talking about what task complexity is and what are its implications for the way we perform tasks. As I mentioned, I have been researching task complexity for a long time because it appears over and over again in the literature, but one of the things you discover is it virtually never gets defined. You can sort of figure out what the author means by the way they're using it, but they don't actually provide a definition. In fact, it's comparable to another term, which is almost never defined, which is rigor. As we talked about in the previous discussion, just as an aside, the best definition I found for rigor was in a nursing journal where they described it as being very systematic in your approach, applying an appropriate research design, and tackling a challenging question. And I thought that that was actually not a bad definition, but that was the only place that I found a definition that didn't involve things like physical fitness. At any rate, I will talk about what complexity is and what its implications are. Feel free to interrupt me at any time if you are confused. I'm going to have to give this presentation in half an hour tomorrow morning, so there better be plenty of time for questions now or I'm never going to get through. So don't stop me at any point with a question. And if I don't appear to be looking at you, then yell or wave violently. When I started working on complexity, one of the things that I discovered is someone who was referencing my work referred to some work done by Karl Popper, known for his work in logic and the question of what can be proven and what can't be proven and all this. And one of his books, published in 1972, talked about three different worlds. And I think those three different worlds are very, very important if you're going to understand complexity. So one world is the world that is entirely internal to our head and is principally non-symbolic. It's our feelings, it is our experiences, all of which happen within the head. And a lot of times when we're talking about complexity, we're actually talking about things that make us feel in a particular way. Makes feeling that something is complex. Now, a second world is the world that's represented in symbols. Now, we can deal with symbols in our head. For example, if I ask you to multiply two-digit numbers in your head, you would use it symbolically. You wouldn't feel the answer. You'd try to do it. And if you were born after about 1975, the odds are that you probably could not do it because you've forgotten how to multiply because you always use a calculator. Which brings us to the second element of symbolic representation. Symbolic representations can be shared across individuals and between individuals and technology. So the symbol world, in a certain sense, coexists within the mind, within technology, within communications medium, because when we communicate, we use symbols to communicate. And so it's a somewhat broader representation. And there's a type of complexity that can be expressed in the world of symbols. Finally, there is the real world. And the real world basically rewards and punishes our performance of a task. So if we're successful in performing a task, you get rewarded. If we're unsuccessful, you get punished. Now, the punishment may just be you're not successful, but the point is that we can't always predict in advance whether our actions are going to lead to rewards or punishments, and that becomes a third form of complexity. So what I'm going to do now is go over each type of complexity and talk a little bit about some of its characteristics. So when we talk about world one, the world of experience, our our sense of complexity is almost entirely driven by unfamiliarity. When we practice a task over and over again, what happens to the way we feel when we perform the task? All right, let me be a little less abstract. How many of you here know how to drive?
A car?
A car, yes, definitely. Yes. Hopefully we've got lots of people who've driven a car before.
Can I interrupt? We have a list here for the certificate that we're gonna have at the end, so please be sure to fill it. Because if you don't fill it, you're not gonna get the certificate. So.
Okay. Thank you.
What happens is tasks get automatic in our life,
Exactly. Automation. So when you start driving, what happens is, what was it like the first time you got behind the wheel? What did you feel? Nervous. You felt it was a very difficult task. It was very uncertain. There was ambiguity. Do I press the brake or the accelerator? What is this gear shift thing?
And what are the people around me going to do?
And what are the people around me going to do? All of these things, and you basically, it takes all of your focus. It puts incredibly high cognitive demands on you. When you do it over and over and over again, when you repeat the task over and over again, what happens to the cognitive demands? Well, you can look around. If you're driving in Florida, it's not unusual to see someone who is driving, talking on the phone, applying makeup, and eating at the same time. Now, is that very effective? Well, for those of us who've been rear-ended multiple times, no, it turns out that probably exceeds their capabilities, but nevertheless, it does not take on the same demands. If you listen to a concert pianist playing Mozart or Beethoven, and you listen to the speed at which the notes take place, it is impossible for the human mind to process information that quickly. But they're not processing information. What they're doing is they're taking an automated task, and it's basically running through, and they don't even have to think about it. So, the interesting thing about experience complexity is that when we are dealing with tasks, there is a certain optimum point for information processing and diversity that occurs when a task is, when we're performing a task. If we go below that threshold, we have boredom. We cease to become effective. If we go above that threshold, we have information overload. We also cease to be effective. Now, over time, this particular curve can shift. So if you get used to a very high cognitive demand task, you start to reach the point where you actually demand a higher level of cognitive demand than the average person. If you're used to very low demanding tasks, what happens is you shift and your optimum becomes lower. But that's a very slow process. It doesn't happen instantly. Otherwise, we are going to take actions to try to keep us in this region if we're going to perform a task. Because that's the region where it feels best. That is where we achieve what's sometimes called flow. Now, as individuals experience growing experience complexity, there are a number of tricks we use to keep ourselves within that optimal range. First off, if the experience complexity is putting too great demands on us, we'll seek to reduce arousal, and we'll apply shortcuts and heuristics. Some of the early experiments in task complexity, such as Kane in 1976, showed when you give people two simulated apartments to choose between, they will systematically go back and forth. You give them like 5, they change the way they process information entirely. What they do is they go through the deck and they quickly eliminate 2 or 3 of the options so they get down to a pair of options that they can actually compare. So we use heuristics to reduce it. We can also do task switching at frequent breaks. A lot of times we will see millennials, for example, on their cell phones during lecture. Now that can mean a number of different things, but one of the things it can mean is they're actually switching back and forth. They're taking a break from the concentration on the lecture, switching, and then at some point they may switch back. In fact, if you study if you study what happens in a 75-minute lecture, what you find is you'll find peaks of concentration and then peaks of lows. Basically, you can't maintain a really high concentration level for more than about 15 or 20 minutes. One problem with higher experience complexity is it usually is usually a result of what are called control processes. Control processes are very hard to automate because they involve frequent decisions. So, unlike playing a piano piece, which is going to play out the same way every time you do it, a task which involves a lot of decisions forces us to go back and forth between automatic and controlled processes. And in a world where experience complexity is higher, what that means is we're going to have fewer opportunities to achieve true mastery. Mastery of a task is a very satisfying experience for us. And so, this is why people will practice a musical instrument over and over again to achieve mastery. And as a consequence, in a world where tasks are constantly changing, we have to accept the fact that mastery is going to become less common. Now, over time, arousal baselines will adjust to higher or lower task demands, but that doesn't happen instantly. And until it happens, you're going to see a profound preference for the status quo. People are not they're not going to want to be pushed outside of their comfort zone. And that means if you suddenly increase the cognitive demands of a task, there's a good chance that they're going to engage in behaviors to bring those cognitive demands back to the comfort zone. And finally, if you're in a constantly changing environment, it's going to be very hard to adapt because consistency is what allows us to move back and forth in terms of our preferences. And this is going to again produce resistance to task restructuring. So just think about these things as we think about experience complexity. This is just one of the types of complexity. Let's move on to the second type. This is the complexity of the world in terms of symbols. And I am calling this intrinsic complexity because if you can look at how a task is performed in symbolic terms, there are techniques you could use, such as Kolmogorov complexity, the minimum number of symbols required to describe the performance of the task that you could use to approximate how complex a task is. Task complexity is not defined entirely by the number of elements. A lot of it is defined by, in fact, the way the elements are organized and interact with each other. So I've got two street maps here. This is a map of Manhattan. This is a map of Boston. Which one of these has higher intrinsic complexity? Manhattan or Boston? Why?
More features, more colors, more concentration.
There's no pattern to it. There's no pattern to it. So if I were writing a computer program, I could compress this map down to a very, very small level because there's so much repetition in it. It would be much, much harder to compress this, and this doesn't even show you the one-way streets and the crazy drivers. So intuitively we can see that. So even though there are about the same number of streets in both these two areas, we see this one as being much more complicated. Yes, go ahead.
Well, I'm just curious because now you're using the term complexity, and then all of a sudden I see complicated.
Well, because the reason I do that is when I am talking about the three different types of complexity, if I keep using the term complexity, nobody's going to know what I'm talking about. So when I talk about experience complexity, I will often refer to unfamiliarity. When I refer to intrinsic complexity, I'll talk about complicated. And then when I talk about extrinsic complexity, the third type, I talk about complex. Basically, it's the same type. It's just basically I'm trying not. Because complexity is so confusing to talk about, I'm trying to be a little bit careful. But even then, I'll sometimes screw up. So, if I start talking about something that's entirely different, let me know. So, intrinsic complexity, in a sense, if you were dealing with expert system technology, which is a rule-based technology, intrinsic complexity really deals with how many rules it's going to take to describe the task. And obviously, the more branching, the more criteria that you have to apply, the more different ways the task can be performed, the larger the rule set. So, what do highly intrinsically complex tasks look like? Well, this is the regulations associated with Obamacare, the American Affordable Care Act, as of I think this was as of 2013. It's gotten bigger since then. 30,000 pages are required to describe the regulations. That is intrinsically complex. The reason it takes 30,000 pages is because of all the rules associated with this. This is the final page of the Dodd-Frank bill passed in the United States to help us better control the behavior of banks and other investors. This was page 2319, and the Dodd-Frank bill didn't even specify the regulations. It simply outlined what regulations needed to be put in place. This is very, very high intrinsic complexity. And you could potentially objectively do it. I did a search on Google for complexity, and they showed this process within a company for requesting a vacation. Again, we've created all sorts of procedures. Now, when I mentioned experienced complexity, what happens when you repeat the task over and over again? What happens to experienced complexity? It tends to go down. With intrinsic complexity, unless you have a fundamental restructuring, what happens as the task gets performed over and over again? Do we remove rules or do we add new rules? We add new rules to discover the criteria that we didn't handle correctly with the original set of rules. So this is why, one of the reasons why you never want to confuse experienced complexity with intrinsic complexity, because intrinsic complexity tends to grow over time unless you have a restructuring. Sometimes we will do that. For example, in the world of astronomy, there was a perfectly adequate model for predicting the position of the planets, which had the Earth as the center of the universe. But it was very, very complicated because the Earth is not a good frame of reference. When we switched over to the heliocentric model with the Sun at the center, suddenly we were able to dramatically compress the rules that we would use for predicting the planets. So every once in a while you'll get this major restructuring, but when you don't have a restructuring, what happens is these systems tend to grow larger and larger. So what are some of the implications of intrinsic complexity? First one I just mentioned, they tend to become more complicated over time. Again, I'm using complicated instead of saying it becomes more complex over time. As I say, sometimes you will get restructuring. We actually saw this in the world of expert systems. One of the early expert systems was designed to configure digital equipment's VAX line of computers, and if you look at the number of rules, it went up to like 2,000 or 3,000, and then all of a sudden they realized they could abstract, they started to learn general principles, they dropped it way down, And then after that, it started to grow again. So I want to make it clear, this isn't something that always happens, but it does happen a lot. Expertise tends to become more and more narrow. When you have a tax code that is 6 million pages long, nobody can be an expert in all of it, so we tend to focus our efforts on a smaller and smaller piece. And, full mastery across a whole task becomes more and more rare. Here, once again, we're dealing with a problem that relates to experience complexity as well, yes?
But like this year, the tax laws have changed so much, haven't you gotten rid of some of that complexity? Haven't you kind of compressed them and made them smaller?
That, you could call that a fundamental restructuring, but actually what they mainly did was they changed the number of tax brackets. But guess what? The number of tax brackets is no challenge at all compared to all the special rules regarding what can and what cannot be deducted. We've certainly changed the experience complexity in the U.S. tax law. A couple of years ago, what we did is we dramatically increased the standard deduction. For people who did not take the standard deduction, they had to itemize, dealing with a huge set of complicated rules. By increasing the standard deduction, what happened is people realized they no longer would get any benefit from itemized, so they don't have to do that. And so that reduces how complicated it is for them. So it reduces the experience complexity for them, but it hasn't really changed the complexity associated with the business. In fact, every time they simplify the tax code, it tends to make things more complicated for business, because what they do is they minimize the impact of the old rules without removing them, and then they add additional rules. Tasks have to increasingly be shared across specialists. Well, this just follows. If expertise is becoming more narrow, we have to share them across specialists. But remember, intrinsic complexity can move not only between people, but also between people and information systems. So I frequently point out that if TurboTax, the package I use to do my taxes, were to be proven wrong, then I have undoubtedly committed multiple felonies, because I am a slave to TurboTax. It tells me what to do and I do it. But this is an information system. It's essentially a rule-based system. And because we can share with technology, what does that do with our ability to increase the intrinsic complexity of our systems? Think about this. If we didn't have technology, would we be able to do things in as complicated a way as we do it today? My university would totally collapse if we removed the personnel system, which everyone hates. It's a PeopleSoft-based system, but all the rules are embedded in the personnel system because nobody knows the rules. In South Africa, they require faculty to retire at 65. They have actually embedded that in their personnel system so that it's impossible to cut a check for anyone who's passed their 65th birthday. I know this because a good colleague of mine just turned 65 and was suddenly out of a job. So here we're looking at not just human specialists, but we're also looking at other specialists. An increasing portion of our tasks needs to be devoted to management, because now all of a sudden we've got all these different pieces of the task which need to be coordinated. How many of you are at a university where the number of administrators has actually gone down over the past 10 years? How many of you are at a university where the number of administrators has gone up? I mean, literally, we've got vice presidents of vice presidents. I mean, one of my colleagues is the chair of the Committee on Committees, which is actually an important role. And finally, supporting systems increasingly drive processes. I would say, how many of you are familiar with ERP, or Enterprise Resource Planning Systems? Some of you must be again. So, one of the big challenges of an enterprise resource planning system is when we put that system in place, we will typically adjust our procedures to fit the needs of the system, which is the opposite of what we used to be told. But in addition, once that system is in place, it is extremely difficult to change the way we're organized, because that would involve changing this system, which is in place, creating huge amounts of resistance. What this also does, it makes us very vulnerable to disruption, because we can't change the way we're doing something if someone who does not have that overhead comes in with a brand new approach. It's going to be very, very hard for us to adapt. Finally, we enter world 3, extrinsic complexity, how the world rewards or punishes the state that we're in. So if we look at a state as being, I'm not referring to countries or states, I'm referring to, states in the computer science, which is basically the value of all the variables that define our existence. If we take a look at states, in a very simple world, if we have 6 variables that define a state, each one of those will contribute to the overall fitness, and I won't go into great detail about fitness, but fitness basically deals with the state's ability to reproduce and to survive. 2 separate areas of fitness. So when we talk about physical fitness, we're talking about our ability to survive. When we talk about the fitness of our species, it's primarily driven by the rate at which we reproduce. But in a decomposable world, each variable contributes to fitness separately. In that world, tools like multiple regression and our statistical tools can be used to determine what piece of the puzzle of our dependent variable is the result of one of our independent variables. How many of you have used regression or tools like that in your analysis? When you use that tool, you are making a fundamental assumption that the world you're dealing with is simple. Now, I've written a couple of papers regarding this because it turns out if the world you're dealing with is complex, your regression tool isn't going to tell you that. There will be a whole bunch of other phenomena, particularly clustering on peaks, that will make it look like the variables are simple, but when you try to replicate it in a different context, it will not work. This is why I sometimes chuckle a little bit when we talk about rigor, because we don't like to expose our research to really adverse conditions, because it turns out our research won't replicate. And by the way, attempts to replicate research in my field and in the field of management are so appallingly bad that our best journals will not publish replication research because it's too embarrassing. In an interacting world, the variables work in combination. You cannot look at the impact of a single variable. Well, you can look at the impact of a single variable at a single point in time, but it depends entirely on the value of the other variables. And as a result, it creates a very, very different landscape for fitness. So try to be a little bit less abstract here. Think about a test, such as the SAT test. Every question has a point value, and all other things being equal, you're much, much better off getting question 17 right than question 17 wrong. As long as all your other answers are the same, getting it right will always be better than getting it wrong. Each question adds its own little piece to the total fitness, which in this case we'll teach at the final test score. That's very simple. And, by the way, there's just one optimum. What's the optimum of a test, of a multiple choice test? How do you reach the optimum? Getting every question right. That's your peak. And there's only one peak. Now, compare this with a cookbook. I would argue that a cookbook, represents a complex environment. Because every recipe, in a sense, is a peak, at least in the author's mind. Because if the author thought you could make the recipe better by adding half a teaspoon of cinnamon instead of a quarter of a teaspoon of cinnamon, what would the author have done? Put in half a teaspoon of cinnamon. So each recipe is a peak. But how well does the learning you have in roasting lamb transfer over to making angel food cake? Very, very different. Because each peak represents an area of local activity. In addition, because we don't have this nice orderly thing where each variable contributes to the overall fitness independently, what happens is you can have very, very small changes produce huge impact. For example, in your cake recipe, what happens when you leave out the baking powder? You're building construction material. Yet, basically you're talking about half a teaspoon of something that doesn't add to the flavor of the cake, it doesn't have any impact. Little tiny differences can have huge impact. Or no impact. You can always add it later, yeah. Or if you add that half a teaspoon of baking powder to a curry recipe, is anyone going to notice? Not the way I make curry. So low extrinsic complexity means that there's a single peak with smooth drop-offs. High extrinsic complexity means there are lots of peaks, and little tiny changes in state can lead to giant drop-offs. So where does this all lead us? Well, first off, with extrinsic complexity, localization. We tend to develop local sets of rules that apply to the peak we're working on, and as long as we don't move too far from that peak, they work okay. And imitation becomes very effective. Because the relationships in extrinsic complexity are so complicated if we represent them symbolically. Notice I'm moving between worlds here. Complicated relationships, because we're dealing with things in combination, produce this peaking phenomenon. One of the best ways to figure out a high fitness strategy is to look for other high fitness agents and imitate everything they do. That produces a process known as homophilia, which is the tendency to imitate self-similar individuals. Combinations determine fitness. Causality cannot be expressed in simple terms. When you're dealing with 10-way interactions or 100,000-way interactions, there's really no explanation of causality that's going to help you better understand the problem because the interactions are so hard. Furthermore, individual factors are going to have a plus or minus impact on fitness depending upon the context, so that general rules don't apply. Very small changes can have a large impact. Again, we talked about that. Transitions will happen very quickly. This is another characteristic of highly extrinsically complex environments, because a transition will always occur from peak to peak. You're on one peak, but you're not comfortable with that peak. There's another peak in the distance you want to move to. How long do you want to spend in the fitness valley between? Very, very little time. So instead of seeing things change gradually, it's much more common to see changes occur very quickly. A good example of this in the U.S. is attitudes towards gay marriage. 10 years ago, it was almost impossible to find more than a few people, outliers, who were in support of gay marriage, and yet there was a period about 5 or 6 years ago where virtually everyone's attitude changed almost instantly, and now it's almost universal support. That didn't happen slowly because it's very uncomfortable being in that valley where you don't know whether or not you support it. You can't find a group that has that ambiguous opinion, so you're going to move very quickly from one group to another. Finally, power laws. A appear frequently. This is an empirical observation, not a theoretical one. You will see over and over again in this type of environment power laws appearing. And by the way, we see it in the size of cities. We see it in the frequency of earthquakes. Power laws appear all over the place. And they're particularly pronounced in highly complex environments, which means outliers can have a very, very large impact, and transitions can occur which are disproportionately large. The bell curve does not help us dealing with power law phenomena, because according to the bell curve, things that are that far from the mean should never occur. So, just in summary, experience complexity is driven by its unfamiliar. The question is, what do we need to know to make it more familiar? Intrinsic complexity, the source is very complicated, which is how do we plan to get to where we want to go? And then finally, extrinsic complexity, the fitness of our goal state, where do we want to be? And I would argue extrinsic complexity is particularly difficult because it essentially, with high extrinsic complexity, it's very, very hard to figure out a path. So, is complexity growing? Because it's all very easy to say it's growing, but is there any reason to believe that it actually might be growing? And I would argue that one of the principal drivers of intrinsic complexity is the availability of information technology, because it allows us to build larger, more complicated, simple systems unhindered by the limits of human information processing capability, which is experience complexity. But there's TurboTax, which I use. Japan, where they're creating AIs to interact with people, given the fact that in 30 years, there's not going to be like 3 young people in all of Japan. And so the question is, how do they deal with this huge challenge? Here is computer models. We're dealing with problems that are so difficult we can't solve them with regular mathematics, so we use computer models to solve them. This is a page from an electronic medical record, where we're basically going beyond the capabilities. Healthcare expands its frontiers. We're beyond the capability of individual doctors and specialists to share information, so we use electronics. This, by the way, you can't read it, but it's the progression towards fully autonomous vehicles. What we're doing is we're building a complicated system that will exceed the performance capabilities of the automated driving that we have learned to do with the human mind. And in the long run, I think it's very likely we will reach a point where suddenly they won't allow people without very specialized training to drive cars because we're so dangerous. My understanding is when the Google vehicle went out and did its several billion miles of driving, it had something like 8 accidents. 7 of those accidents occurred when it was rear-ended because it stopped at a yellow light. The most dangerous condition is where we've got fully autonomous vehicles driving with human beings on the road at the same time, because the human beings are not going to react predictably. And so I think there's a very, very good chance that we will actually see regulations put in place to prevent that hazard, the human driver, from existing. So this is... The other thing is the pace of change. And last year I was honored by receiving the Randall Award for cybernetics, something I know nothing about, but as a result, every presentation I have to have at least one cybernetic diagram. That was like a requirement of the award. So we have a system behavior, and we observe the behavior. Information technology increases our ability to access data in real time, so we can get the data much faster. In the U.S., we're required to do a census every 10 years. In 1870, or 1880, I can't remember which one, it took 7 years to compile all the data. So we were just about starting the next census. That was when the Tabulating Machine Company of America introduced punch cards to handle this, and that company later became IBM. Now we are getting in data at a frightening pace. We are better able to model behavior. Analytics and AI tools are increasing this ability, and you have decision support systems where the humans work with computers. That increases our ability to model behavior, and with our technology, we can change behaviors more quickly. Now, this doesn't necessarily make the intrinsic behaviors more complicated, but what it does do is it compresses the time over which changes take place. And that is going to be one of the factors, because if you have changes taking place at a more rapid pace, the likelihood that you will from time to time get big disruptions according to the power law is going to be higher and higher. We're also increasing the size of our systems. By globalizing commerce, we're creating more and more connections between our systems. The internet is moving rapidly, and where the internet is not moving fast enough, we're using cell phones to access the internet. This is what's happening in Africa, where in South Africa, there are 1.25 cell phones for every person in the country. We are seeing social networks that are now creating new ways of grouping together. And, of course, the expansion of mobile means we're no longer tied to our desk. We're literally got ubiquitous computing. I have got more computing power than there was in the world the year I was born, sitting on my belt right here, annoying me. Occasionally buzzing for unknown reasons. So, the challenge we face is increasing connectivity, accessibility of data. Technological advances are enabling changes in complexity. Technology does not force changes, but it does enable changes. It's impacting the pace of change, the size of the fitness landscape, because the number of choices is driven by the number of states we can enter, and we're rapidly increasing the number of states that are available for us to enter. And our ability to automate, to react to states more rapidly, and to share information across individuals. The fitness landscape and ability to automate will increase our intrinsic complexity. I take the TurboTax example and all these other systems that allow us to have these very, very complicated rules. The pace of change and the size of the fitness landscape increase extrinsic complexity. Both of these things drive to increase the complexity as we experience it. What do we do, given that our curves can't shift that rapidly back and forth? Well, there are a variety of things that we can do. We can rely more heavily on experts, and these are both human experts and machine experts. We can make more and more of our decisions by imitation. As I mentioned, imitation is a very powerful strategy when dealing with a highly complex business landscape. We can disengage from tasks. Cognitive demands become too great. Shift our attention to something else for a while we take a break and then come back. We can use old heuristics. My God, the entire field of economics is driven by heuristics that we have plenty of evidence don't actually work, but they're better than nothing at all. Literally, the heuristics economists are using are the same heuristics that I was taught in the 1960s and 70s, and we've had multiple episodes, stagflation, quantitative easing. All these things show that they don't actually work, but they're better than nothing because you have to base your decisions on something. And we can shorten our time horizons. So, you put all these things together, and what I'd like to point out is that Gen Z and millennials are facing complexity of a fundamentally different nature than what, say, I faced growing up in the 1960s. We see it in the instability of career paths. Nobody expects to work for the same company for 30 or 40 years and then retire. We see it in the diversity of relationships. Whether you like diverse relationships or you don't like diverse relationships, the fact is there are a whole lot more choices. I am told that Canada has now like 26 different definitions of gender that you can attach to. The LBD whatever list has actually gotten so long they've run out of letters. These are all choices that you can make. In the old days, religion was a stabilizing influence, whether you're religious or not. It provided a certain set of rules to follow, but now what's happening is it's falling apart. And, part of that has to do with, the other factors impacting people, but also part of them is the increasing realization that the figures that we admire in religion are often human. And shattering of gender and class stereotypes. Stereotypes are a way of keeping people in place, but they're also a way of establishing order. If you eliminate all stereotypes, then suddenly you're dealing with a massive increase in the complexity that you need to deal with. Specialization of work. It's no longer sufficient to say, hey, I want to be in programming or a career that didn't exist 50 years ago. Or I'm now narrow and narrower. And that creates a whole bunch of choices for our graduates. And finally, we've got many, many more informing channels. We've got Google. We've got Facebook. We've got Wikipedia. We have all these different channels. And so, ultimately, I would argue that our new students are facing a world that is very, very different from the ones that we face. So I'm just about to break. What I would say here is that one of the things that we're seeing as people deal with this increased experience complexity is a number of coping mechanisms. One of them is homophilia, the tendency to group together with self-similar individuals. One of the things that social networks have done is they have made it much, much easier to find people with the same point of views that we have. And to make sure that they have the same points of view, we overshare. We give much more information than we need to, but it's a way of making sure that we have a clear group identity. Our principal informers are our peers, people who are experiencing the same world that we are. Task switching, multitasking, and job hopping are becoming increasingly ways of dealing with tasks that are becoming too complex. Enforcing orthodoxy. If you've got a group of very similar people, you can look at them and each decision they make, you can see, does it help them or hurt them? And if it helps them, then you can make the same decision. That doesn't work when you have a lot of diversity within the group you're looking at. So as a result, we will enforce an orthodoxy. So if you're within a particular group, it's going to determine your views on a lot of issues that you really don't have a strong opinion on. One of the things that's amazing to me, whether you're a skeptic or whether you're agreeing with the consensus of scientists, the number of non-scientists who will basically make very strong assertions about climate change just because they have heard, because the members of their group feel that way. And this is, this creates a very interesting, and this is not the only area, but it's one where there's a huge consensus. We also demonize heretics, or heretics, because we want to avoid that orthodoxy. We seek out compatible channels. We don't, if you're in one group, you will never watch Fox News. If you're in another group, you will never watch MSNBC, because it just creates too much cognitive dissonance. Too many core assumptions are not believed. Finally, we shorten our time horizons. This group has more debt than any group before, but they have fewer homes. And it's all educational debt. And yet the education that many of them sought out was not one that would necessarily improve their earning prospects. So, this is the world that this group is dealing with, and the question I pose is, how does our education system deal with this and help them better cope with the high complexity world which is not going to go away? So with that, what I will do is, why don't we take a break for lunch? I think we've got an hour scheduled. We can come back at 1:10. I'll try to finish up within 50 minutes. What I'm going to do is talk about some of the things that we might be teaching our students, and I'll spend about maybe 10 or 15 minutes talking about that. Then I'm going to hand out a sheet to everybody, and I'm going to ask you to think about some of the educational techniques that you use and try to map them to this world. And I desperately need these examples because, as I say, I'm presenting this tomorrow, and obviously I'm going to be very short of time. I need nice, crisp examples. And so with that, why don't we take a break for lunch? I've followed the Gene's conversational sessions before, so I know this is a constant hazard, but I don't want to take time from the other sessions that are following mine. So before lunch, we talked about complexity and how it affects, the newest generations entering the workforce. Now what I want to look at is how this might translate to the skills that are needed in the workforce for the coming years, and then finally we'll switch over to how we might educate people for those skills. And I don't want to take more than 15 minutes talking about the skills, so I really want to spend some time on hearing from you ways that we could educate people to more effectively match the skills that we need. So, to start with, 25 years ago, in my department, at the time I was at Florida Atlantic University, and we basically went out to practice and asked them, what skills are you interested in having from our students? And honestly, we were primarily interested in technical skills, because we figured that was, since we were an information systems major, we figured they'd be interested in technical skills. But instead, what we heard is, most important skills is graduating people who can communicate. We want good problem solvers. We want people who can work in groups and collaborate with others, and we want the ability to learn. Well, at the time, I thought that was rather unique, but it turns out that everybody who did the study around those times found those 4 skills. Now, whether that was really what employers wanted or not, we couldn't test that, but it was definitely what they said they wanted. Communication, problem-solving, collaboration, and ability to learn. So, when I was preparing this presentation, and literally, when I was preparing this presentation, I said to myself, all right, well, let's see what the skills are today. So I Googled, what skills are we looking for in the workforce? And communication, problem-solving, collaboration, and ability to learn were there universally. But what I found was 2 other skills appeared in a lot of these. And I would encourage you to Google the same things, just because literally this is not based on deep research. This is based on Googling. Creativity, and one I find particularly interesting, resilience. And I find resilience particularly interesting because resilience is a skill that you really need if you're dealing with excessive cognitive demands. We need people who can take it over a sustained period of time. So, pardon?
And bounce back.
And bounce back, right, exactly. Yeah. And so, what I did is I just went through each of these 6 skills and said, okay, if intrinsic complexity is increasing, if extrinsic complexity is increasing, what does this mean that we need now? And we still need oral and written communications. But now there are a bunch of other things that we need with communication skills. We've got to fit our communication to the appropriate medium. I cannot tell you how much damage an email can do if it's written to the wrong person. You know, the most dangerous button on the computer is the send button on your email. The second most dangerous button is reply all. Appropriate sharing. Facebook scares the heck out of me because Facebook is designed to share within a homophilous group of individuals who are basically trying to find out about each other in depth. But when employers look at it, they're outside the group. They are not going to understand why you're sharing things. And finally, choosing appropriate channels of communication. Understand that none of these things were issues when I graduated. These are fundamentally new things that our recent graduates are experiencing that people like myself never had to worry about. Problem solving. I was taught to look for right answers. You know, my education, mathematics and so forth, there is a right answer to this problem. I was taught algorithmic methods to solve problems. Very reductive and causal. I always wanted to understand causality. One of the most challenging experiences for me in my professional career was when I left Harvard, and I graduated very young. I completed my degree requirements when I was 19, and then I went into the U.S. Navy as a nuclear submarine officer. And one of the things that I discovered is that piping diagrams with 5,000 valves in them are incredibly difficult to understand. It actually requires a different approach, a different type of thinking to internalize those. And it was a type of thinking that I had never learned. Well, every technology that we're dealing is now dealing with the same type of thing. So what are some of the things that we have to worry about in today's problem solving? We don't want a right answer, we want a high fitness answer. An answer that will work well enough so if we're faced with the same problem, we use the same approach. Doesn't matter if it's an optimum, it matters that it's high fitness. We have to rely much more heavily on search than knowledge. Remember, with extrinsic complexity, it's almost impossible to provide a cogent definition of causality. Instead, what we have to do is we have to basically search out incremental changes that increase the fitness of the state that we're in. We now have infinite sources of data that we didn't have before, but now we've got to figure out what are the reliability of these sources, because there are lots of data sources that are entirely inappropriate. And ultimately, we have to spend a lot more time experimenting. If you can't determine the underlying way things work, then you have to experiment to see, well, is this going to make things better or worse? And so we're constantly making small manipulations to our state and looking at how the environment responds to them. It's still a problem-solving skill, but it's a different approach to problem-solving. Collaboration. In the old days, that meant working in local groups and breaking up tasks that assign them to different people. Nowadays, we're sharing our tasks with technology as well as people. So we've got to learn how to balance technology and people and have each one do what they're good at. Don't let technology make your decisions for you, but take into account the advice the technology is suggesting. We need collaboration that benefits from diversity. One of the big challenges is if you live in an echo chamber, you're never going to hear something different. And there are lots and lots of different types of diversity. Folks at Harvard are so proud of themselves and the education they deliver, and they talk about how diverse their student body is. Yes, it's extremely diverse. They go from the 99.8 percentile to the 99.999 percentile on all test scores. You look at my class, on the other hand, and when I teach an undergraduate class, I am dealing with individuals from the 40th percentile all the way up to the 99th percentile, and I'm expected to design an educational approach that adds value to all of them. As far as I'm concerned, there's a diversity that really matters. It doesn't matter what people's skin color is, what background they have. If you're dealing with that huge range, you have to be very creative in your problem solving. And in collaboration, companies need to benefit from diversity because nowadays, if they don't take diversity into account, their CEOs are going to end up going to prison. They're going to end up having product boycotts. There are all sorts of things that happen if you don't recognize the different perspectives. Finally, we have to deal with collaboration that are separated both by distance and time. The world has changed. In the War of 1812, the most famous battle, the Battle of New Orleans, was fought 2 weeks after the war had ended because it takes too much time for information to flow. But now we're expected to collaborate over a distance. If you look at my class in information systems, the last class that I taught had 40 people in it. 38 were from India, 1 was from Thailand, and 1 was from the U.S., but his father was Indian. So, literally, these are the folks, many of whom are going to be going back to India, and we're going to have to collaborate with them. These is a very different skill set. Ability to learn. In the old days, we acquired it from the classroom and we acquired it from mentors on the job. Where are we acquiring our information from today? Well, first off, it's a lot more self-directed, on demand. When you see people wandering around with their cell phones, maybe they're participating in Facebook, or maybe they're looking up terms like doxa. Because who the hell knows what doxa is? I certainly didn't, yeah. So, I had to look it up. So, we have to think about the appropriateness of our sources. When I was in school, you'd go to an encyclopedia. There were only 2 of them. There was the Encyclopedia Britannica and there was the World Book Encyclopedia. Now we have infinite sources of information, many of which are being updated on a regular basis, like Wikipedia. And finally, we have to learn from experiments. Because basically, in this world of high extrinsic complexity, we're constantly making small changes and moving back and forth. And we have to be able to learn from them. So, creativity is a new one being added about. In the old days, it was more like we'd worry about it later, because entry-level jobs don't involve any creativity, so it's something you can acquire as you move up the chain. And it was only needed in some jobs. Yeah, okay, if you're going to work for an ad agency, we add creativity to the list. But now, all sorts of companies are adding creativity, because you have to be creative to react to the disruptive changes that are occurring at a faster rate because we've compressed the timeline. We have to be creative because we're constantly confronted with the need to find information. There are lots of resources out there. We have to be able to think creatively about where these resources might come from and what models might be used. So if you look at big data, big data goes nowhere if you don't start with a creative model. You'll just find lots of data. And we need to devise experiments. So at a much lower level, creativity is valuable in today's highly complex workforce. Finally, resiliency. In the old days, we assumed it. We expected you to be resilient. When I joined the Navy, nobody told me, now you're going to have to learn resiliency. They made me go through, several years of hell, acquiring it on my own because, they weren't going to be my mother and wipe my nose. And Also, it was less critical because jobs had a more routine feel to them, and if you do a routine job over and over again, the cognitive demands go down, so you don't need to be as resilient. Now, we need it because we're going to cope with this high arousal level. We want to avoid counterproductive disengagement. When you take a break from a task because the strain's too great and then come back to the task, that's okay. If you take a break from a task and then never come back to the task, that's not so okay. And so we need to help people figure out how to disengage without completely disengaging. And we need to be more adaptable to change because change will happen. You know, the students graduating today may very well end up doing 15 or 20 different jobs. When I was growing up, my father was a professor at Harvard in economics, and he left at age 43 to become a professional opera singer. At the time, that was unusual enough so that he, it was like the second cover story of Money Magazine. Today, more and more, we are going to be seeing career changes that are almost as radical as a result of the way that industries are changing and complexity is disrupting the world. So, in the old days, we tend to look at these skills separately. Okay, we'll test your communication skill. We'll test your problem-solving skill. We'll test your ability to collaborate. We'll test your ability to learn. And together, they, indicated how effective you were going to be. In the more complex world, all of these skills interact with each other. For example, the ability to collaborate is going to be critical to the ability to problem solve because you're not going to be able to problem solve without collaboration. The communication skill is the glue that allows these two things to go back and forth. Without the ability to learn, you're going to keep doing the same mistakes over and over again. Resilience, again, is driving the whole thing. I mean, there wasn't really a good, smart art to do this, but this gives you the idea. There are just lots of pieces and they all interact with each other. Guess what? That's the extrinsic complexity I keep talking about. So, that brings us to the question of what pedagogical approaches can be used to better fit the demands of complexity. This is where I am going to try to involve everyone. And if I could, maybe I'll enlist my wife and son to pass these things out to everybody. Just make sure everybody gets a copy. What I'm doing is I'm giving you a copy of the various things that I will be showing on different slides, just to give you an idea. What I did is I took what was on the right-hand side of each of these diagrams, and I brought them over onto a single slide. So communications, selecting channels, appropriate sharing, fits the medium being used, problem solving. So you're going to get a sheet with all 6 of these things. And then, the question I am posing for you is, what pedagogies, innovative or otherwise, are you employing, and which of these skills do you think they might help you, or help our graduates acquire? And just to give you an example of what I'm hoping to produce for tomorrow's lecture, or tomorrow's plenary session, which is the first plenary session. I can't believe Chief did this to me. I was hoping he'd have me like on Friday, so I'd have some time to digest this. But no, I got to get this done by tomorrow. Here's an example of the type of thing that I'm hoping to get out of this. One of the techniques that I use in my classes are case discussions. And case discussions, basically we take an open-ended, in-depth case study of a real world situation that is basically that's built around a decision that needs to be made, and we talk about it in class. And the idea is for individuals to propose different ways this decision could be made, drawing upon data in the case. And And the case typically includes both relevant and irrelevant information, and there is no right answer. So, when we conduct case studies online, and I'm doing a course right now that involves conducting cases online, we do it using asynchronous forums so that people basically discuss back and forth in online forums. I will also say, and I've done surveys on this, students report learning much more from the discussions than they do from the cases themselves. Preparing the case before the discussion is a necessary first step, but the discussion is where a lot of the real learning takes place. And you guys have just been, Marcus just went through a discussion. Is this an accurate prediction of cases?
Yes, and I'm looking at the sentence that says there's no right answer. Thank goodness for that, because otherwise you would have thrown me out of course by now. Yes.
And very often after the discussion, people come out with a totally different perspective. So how do I see that as fitting in? Well, in problem solving, it clearly is we're looking for a fit answer as opposed to a right answer. Because in many cases, I don't know whether what we come up with is right. I just know there are a lot of solutions that would be worse. And that's when we're trying to avoid the really bad ones, or the predictably bad ones. Choosing data, by virtue of the fact that the cases, which are typically 25 to 30 pages long, now the text is maybe 10 or 12 pages, single space, and then we have exhibits, basically gives you a lot of data, and not all of it is necessarily that relevant to the case. One thing about case study discussions is they really benefit from a diverse group. People coming in with different perspectives. The last thing you want in a case discussion is everybody coming in thinking the same thing. When that happens, I, as the facilitator, need to disrupt it. I need to get people to pop up different ideas. But ideally, if you have a very diverse group, one of the things people are going to do is they're going to start developing appreciation for diversity, because they won't believe that folks came in with such different opinions from the ones that they had.
And there's, I'll make a point of that. People also bring different backgrounds, which means that they approach the case studies in a different way, so they dissect them differently. So the end result, there are 20 different end results in the class, because everyone dissects it and then arrives at that endpoint.
And sometimes a small assumption difference, sometimes it's not even something that's in the case, so you have to make an assumption. A small assumption difference can, in fact, produce a big difference. So that is the type of thing, that's the type of end product that I'm hoping to produce from this exercise. And so what I'd like to do is give everybody about 10 minutes just to think about your own experiences and try to come up with something, that you think is a good fit with the world that I have portrayed. And maybe you can't find anything that's a good fit. But we'll let you sort of spend 10 minutes on your own, and then what I want you to do is I want you to come back and talk with me about what it is you found. Because as I say, what I want to do is internalize these suggestions so that I can present them tomorrow. Yeah, this was a very adventurous plan on my part, but I hadn't realized that she was going to schedule me for tomorrow. So has everybody got a sheet? Okay, so we'll give you about 10 minutes, and then we'll. All right. Well, let's just see what people have, and then if we've got other stuff, then we'll. So, would someone like to volunteer? Please, someone volunteer. Oh, thank you. And just let me get your name down. So, okay, so go ahead and tell me.
Anybody want to?
Yeah, just tell me a little bit about what you're doing and where you think it fits.
So my name is Arjun Sila. So I'm from India. I'm doing my PhD in educational psychology and pedagogy, learning styles and learning methods. I'm trying to build for Internet of Things knowledge areas. So going by the pedagogical practices and approaches Professor was talking about, so I kind of shortlisted like 4 learning methodologies widely. One is the project-based learning. The second one is the collaborative learning. The third one is the experiential learning. And the fourth one is the technology-enabled learning. So everything I have like kind of researched 4 aspects under everything. So under project-based learning, I feel students should be encouraged to build some working prototypes or products by the end of the semester. And then also, some should be encouraged to do a research-based activity wherein they should be encouraged to publish papers, attend conferences. This is the second one, research-based activity. Third one is a problem-solving activity where they should be encouraged. They should be given a real lifetime happening scenario or problem and asked to go over how would they solve them. And the fourth one would be a case discussion where they have to dissect and come up with a solution to analyze the case. So these 4 are under the project-based learning. And the second one would be collaborative. And under this, the first one would be to encourage group tasks and assignments where they would come up with a 1-page or a 2-page write-up regarding any assignment given to them. The second one would be the knowledge sharing activity, like think, pair and share, where 2 people or 4 people in a group would exchange ideas and together come at a collaborative result or a solution. The third one would be seminar-based activity. Encourage students to conduct seminars once a week and pick up an emerging topic and present it to the class. And the fourth one would be a flipped classroom activity, where a student would take the role of a teacher and prepare then and there and then deliver it to the class. So these are the aspects of collaborative learning. And experiential learning, the first one would be activity-based or hands-on tasks, where the student would get his hand dirty in a form of an internship or doing some experiments. The second one would be a laboratory-based tasks, where you encourage every course to have a laboratory, a set of exercises or experiments at the end of the course. And the third one would be simulation-based tasks, where you are in the world of augmented reality and virtual eye tests, where you would encourage students to come up with a simulated-based experiments. And the fourth one would be role play and characterization, where a student would take up a role and act accordingly according to the situation, and people would take up those roles and find out how to go about encountering that challenging situation and come up with a solution. The last one is technology-enabled learning. And how would you do that is, and professor would come up with his own or her video lecture where the student could go rewind back and find out what exactly had been covered so that his retention will help. It does not have to fall on just the classroom face-to-face. Second one is e-learning. Professor to encourage to take up MOOCs. There is Coursera, edX, where students can learn a particular topic on MOOCs, on Coursera, through e-learning. And the third one is encouraging asynchronous discussion boards, online discussion boards. The students across the probably different universities or colleges or countries would exchange their ideas. And the last one to encourage would be an hypermedia software or animation. Students are into video games and things like that, so encourage teaching through using some kind of a media or an animated software where it would really be, tempting enough for students to go through that and learn. So in a classroom, you really need to find out if a student is an active learner or a reflective learner, is a visual learner or a verbal learner, is he a sensing learner or an intuitive learner. Based on the learning styles, accordingly you can map the learning methodologies and take care of a diversified learning environment to promote the learning effectiveness in the classroom.
Okay, that's fantastic. I'm glad I called on you first. What we might do is if we can find maybe a little bit of time later this afternoon, what we can do is we can go through each of these and we can map them to the specific objectives here on the list, because most of them have fit multiple objectives, and that will give you a whole bunch of slides. Oh, cool. All right. Of course, you're going to be a tough act to follow, but who's ready to toss in something? Okay, thank you. You can sit down. Let me just make sure I've got your name though, because it's
Okay, give you a phone number.
Already need it.
Yeah. Yeah, we call it a business card. Okay.
Aurora, my co-worker, and I, Diana, we came from Costa Rica, and our university is the only one in Houston State University. That means we are semi-government and common students.
Oh,
And because we have this.
so he's stealing the
Hey guys, remember the warning about all the side discussions being picked up.
Okay, and because we are distant university, doesn't mean we are different. Because sometimes people can confuse it, but we are very much support, but not in this what I mean is we use an LMS, we use a learning management system, which is Moodle. So all our classes or courses have Moodle. So we have to design the instruments, evaluation instruments, 4 months before we start the classes. And our instruments and also the material we use is especially designed for people that have to learn by themselves. And they have to be very self-conscious.
Self-directed.
Self-directed.
Okay.
So right now we're using a lot of I try to combine it with the native Spanish speakers. So we use a lot of virtual reality, which is when you have a QR and cell phone, and we open a new set of material. We're using a lot of simulators. We're using a 3D reality. We're using a lot of 3D which involve robotics and Linux. So another thing that is called my attention is we use a lot of technology in our classes because we don't know our service. We don't need them. All our communication is through the platform and through phone call or through email.
Yeah. Okay.
We have, but we have what we call tutorials, that is presential sessions, that is sitting on time. Maybe 10 or 400. So we use more virtual sessions.
Yep.
Oh yeah, well this is very interesting. I might have to talk about it. I have people in general that are studying with us.
Yeah.
Prisoners?
Yeah.
Studying with us, so we have to adecuaciones curriculares in Spanish. So we have to readapt all the material that we have to send them because they don't have the internet.
Okay, yeah, okay.
They have a computer use, but maybe once a week or 1 hour or something like that. So we have to send them a big package with the material, the books, and the CD with all the instructions what they have to do.
Okay, great. Well, maybe during the break, when they have the break, I can try to map some of what you're talking about here over to. Oh, you've done a mapping. Oh, thank you. Great. Well, thank you. No, thank you very much. All right. Who we got next? Okay. We got someone over there. Oh, yes. Go ahead. Najib, maybe you can help over here because since I don't speak Spanish, I'm going to have a heck of a time helping you. But Najib can help here. So
you trust me on that?
No, but you're available. Remember, you're the translator. You're not the moderator.
Hello, if you trust me translating, will not require more creativity.
Yeah, if you start talking about doxa, I know you're making it up when you're at home. Please, go ahead.
What do you speak about abilities?
Yeah.
The context of we usually do authors. To refer to.
Okay, and actually, let me just get your name first, because I'm gonna forget that. Trying to make sure I don't this is good. Okay. Okay. So you've got two authors. Got it?
The health,
In health, right?
Uno de ellos es Miller,
Miller is one of them.
que trasciende en la calidad de la comunicación.
He transcends what's related to communication. ¿Qué quiere decir trasciende?
Es la base principal de todas las habilidades.
He provides the general base for all the capacity.
La siguiente que viene es resolución de problemas.
The next one is the resolution of problems.
Okay.
Es en tres dimensiones.
Three dimensions.
Conocimiento,
Knowledge,
procedimiento,
procedure,
instrumentales
instruments or tools,
y la actitud.
and the attitude, not just the attitude, but the attitude.
Now I got four here. So we had knowledge, procedures, introduction of tools, and then attitude/aptitude.
Yeah. All that is was related to attitude, and she had attitude.
Okay.
Attitude.
Attitude, yeah.
Yeah, I told you, don't trust me.
Yeah.
Luego viene la parte de colaboración.
Next is the part of collaboration.
Okay.
Atendiendo a la nueva humana y beneficiando con la diferencia de las ciudades.
Addressing, the number of persons, but especially addressing the variety of cultures.
Okay, yeah.
I suppose that she's talking about national culture inside the same country.
Right.
The information and communication technology is being used in all its collaboration.
Yeah.
Luego viene la habilidad del autoaprendizaje y gestión de la
And then after that it comes the ability, the faculty of self-learn.
Okay, so.
I love it. Is that how you say it? Oh, okay. Self-learn and to manage this self-learning.
Yep.
Exactly. And the last thing is, which is not the least, but the last is resilience.
Okay.
Because of the changing world, and all that.
Yeah. So the major headings I had were resolution, collaboration, self-learning, resilience. The first one, I didn't understand the Miller. That was...
It was an author that it was based on.
Oh, based on, okay.
Bloom. I know the other.
Bloom's taxonomy.
Yeah,
Yep.
taxonomy, yes.
Yep. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. Oh, perfect.
So you thank her, don't thank me.
Yeah. No. Well, I had to listen to you talk about doxa. So I developed a credit balance on that. Let's see. We got another. Go ahead.
I just got two because I don't know how to follow these three acts so far. This great information that they've given. So I've been a former instructor and I'm a student, so I've kind of gotten a chance to see both sides. Also, I work in cybersecurity right now, so some of the training that we did So I've kind of seen like three different viewpoints. Dealing with communication. The thing that I've seen that I've worked with best has been encourage learning through asynchronous meetings. And what I mean by that is, so I've been in the program for about 3 months now, right? The thing that I've learned the most, and the way that I've learned the most, is through communication with my peers, through like different applications. We use an application by the name of Slack, and through this medium, we constantly communicate amongst students, and that's where a lot of the learning occurs. Well after being in the classroom, if you have a chance to implement those types of mediums, very, very beneficial. The second thing is through the collaboration, team-based critical thinking exercises. Team-based critical thinking exercises. When teams are placed in positions where they must learn on the fly, where they must learn in a environment where they are faced with unexpected situations, that's when the learning really occurs. Because what it forces, you have a lot of dynamics that occur. Not only is the team learning what you intend them to learn, but they are being forced to collaborate and communicate, and they really find out a lot, and they gain knowledge from the people around them. So, that's all I have.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's see, who else have we got?
Did he tell you that he's giving all his idea for his plenary taken?
Yes.
That's the reason why I tried to get his name.
Yeah,
Okay, good. No, I don't feel bad about taking your time.
No, but then I have the right to say my mind.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, one of the things that we struggled with was actually scaling these kinds of activities up. That's difficult to do. But so what we did, we do it for a few years now. Fourth-year students do a consultancy project. We work real closely with the industry in the region, and so we have quite a good database. And in September, we send out an email to everybody and ask them, hey, are you working on a specific problem that maybe our students can help you with? And so we have that in our database. Students can go to the database, and then they, in groups of 4 to 5 students, approach the firms. And they try and define the problem with the owner. It's usually an SME, with the owner director of the firm. So they're involved in that real fuzzy, wicked problem aspect of trying to understand somebody who's got a real problem who doesn't really know what that problem is. Right? So I don't know if that kind of goes under maybe resilience or problem solving. But the students are required to devise a feasible solution to that problem, as well as an implementation plan for the solution.
Okay, good.
So they have to understand. So, for example, they worked for the one who worked with a beer brewery that was trying to use the potato peels from a company that made French fries, and they had to see all the logistics aspects of it. So it took a whole broad scala of disciplines. And they write that up in a report and present it to the firm as well as to the peers. So in communication, they need to make sure that the firm can understand the language that they use, so it fits the medium, for example. The problem solving, they need to find an answer that fits with that firm. There's no one right answer. It's what the boss says. Okay, that sounds good. Searching for knowledge is a difficult one for them because it's also highly context related. It's not necessarily academic publications on how to transfer potato peels into beer. It's not really something that you read too much about. Collaboration is implicit in projects. Students who notice rarely meet face to face. They use whatever medium they can, WhatsApp, or they have also groups and that kind of stuff they use. Typically, they use whatever they want. Ability to learn, appropriate online sources. Again, they need to use online sources because there's little academic knowledge there, there's mostly sector-specific knowledge. Whose knowledge is it anyway? Creativity, you have to have a creative solution that the owner of the SME says, okay, that's really good, I'll go with that. Yeah, and then resilience, I had written down, firms don't really know what their problem is, so what we notice in the problem definition period is the students are so frustrated because the owner, he doesn't know what the problem is either. So it's like, we thought, here, is this what you need, sir? And he says, no. Yeah, that's real consultancy. So again, it's kind of like experiential learning.
Learning in the world. No, that's we can map that. It's okay. I'll note that down.
10 weeks and it's 5 European credits.
Okay. I'm not sure what your credit
That's
is.
125 hours.
Okay. Cool. All right. Any other? Yes. Oh, wonderful. Your name is partially covered up. Okay. Great. Thank you.
I'm from Hungary, and I specialize in informatics and how to teach informatics in school.
What was the first word you said? I heard.
Didactics.
Didactic informatics. Okay, and that's
And politics and computer programs.
Yeah.
So actually, what we do in class is a method of coaching.
Okay.
It's not a big problem. It depends on the age of the students and their background and so on and so on. And the drive that conversation and the big problem broken up into small pieces, and it's like a brainstorming. The students have to answer these small questions. And even the slowest one, the anyway quiet one, can answer this question and participate in the conversation. And this way, we have to put together the solution, and then we have to solve it somehow with the computer. So this is the basic idea. So everyone can participate, everyone can answer the small questions actually. Everyone would be happy to participate. We focus on basic skills, and we focus on how to implement the force, the computational thinking skill in their everyday life. So these students are from different backgrounds, and with this coaching method, we can put together the knowledge and build up a system. And this is the way we use this coaching method in computer program solving. The other thing we do is that we only use authentic content. We just make the class more motivating. We follow down that students hate typing, students hate annotate text.
Yeah.
I mean, actually documents and so on and so on. But when you present authentic sources, we can realize that we can do it better. We can solve this problem. We can provide many different solutions. And actually, this is motivating to the way of the problem for us.
Just out there, can you give me an example of a type of problem that you might give the type of big problem you might do?
Oh, okay, yes. What we do in class is that we start with the last page in the data table
Okay.
and convert this data table, that table actually, into the normal data table. So during the conversion process, we meet so many technical problems, so many theoretical problems that it helps the students to build up these basic skills. How to handle data types, how to handle actually conversion from one type to another type. How we can handle text as data type, how we can handle numbers as data type, and so on and so on and so on. And actually with this method, we can figure out how the web page is structured. In general, this is the semantic analysis. And through this conversation process, we can show, we can teach how to design that page.
Well, I mean, actually, that's a very nice example of that's really cool. So, I don't want to take too much of the next session's time, in spite of Donald's encouragement. but do we have anyone else who has got something that they want to share? Well, thank you very much. Now, sorry, I didn't see a hand.
No, I am Ana Maria. We are from Ecuador, Loja, field, and we work in a
see your name, so I can.
Ana Maria.
She was just searching for it.
Okay, so. Okay, actually, just one right down. It's going to be really embarrassing if I get the name wrong.
It's just that Anna Maria, just like Anna Maria.
All right.
So I am a teacher of mass communication, and I work in a media lab, and we try to get an experience learning based experimental work. And it's hard because I love to participate about diversity, and we confront to that every day in Ecuador, in the Ecuadorian university system. Our students are very diverse. They are high range and low range, like you said, and that's the key, because that diversity we have to engage them in their reality. So we went in a project named Storytelling. Storytelling is a solid humanity-based communication, no? But we apply the storytelling in education. So we, as we are mass communication teachers, we apply a project in storytelling in journalism. So they have to work an assignment over the period, telling a story that happens in their community. The thing is that, like I was talking with my partner over here, they are very, these are very genius consumers of technology. They can use Instagram to do stories of their life. But when you put that in academic field, that's when it gets hard to connect that. That there is a project that is called Transmedia Literacy from Carlos Escolari and David Buckingham in education. And they have researched over 10 years over that field, and they have they haven't done a list of, like you're doing, the skills that can be transported over real life to education, academic field. But we are taking our work in that field. And results are exciting. We have learn about the students. Students have learned about the community, and they have used analogical and digital tools like Instagram, like Facebook, right? They have used storytelling as the ancient community told to them and things. That practice is applied in education. There is a methodology that is called storytelling in education. So I invite you to learn about it.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. Boy, you got some great ideas. Apparently, I'm not going to get much sleep tonight. Right. Get this all down.
I just had a really short list and I can talk really fast.
Okay.
So, one is creating a class business startup. One is an externship, face-to-face externship, where students go out into the community and find their own opportunity. Another is an online internship, a problem to solve in-house. So at the university, you throw a problem. Another is, I've done this myself, using Twitter to teach. When I find cool stuff, to be able to push it out, so not to ditch, but to teach. And another is to form ties with local industry and nonprofits, especially, to be able to do some good for nonprofits. For instance, you could use business skills, strategy evaluation, SWOT analysis, whatever some local nonprofit might need, and take the skills with it to work.
Okay. The second one, I got the class business startup online internship. You had an externship, which has a different meaning for me. So, what was that? The idea of the externship?
When they're finding their own.
Okay.
You're not placing them per se. They're going out and doing their own research to find the opportunity.
Okay.
And they've got work to do. They're going after something they really want to do, whereas there's a list of doing an internship.
Okay. Great. Anyone else?
That's my guess, I can tell you later.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I need a little.
Yeah, that's right. So, all right. So, thank you all very much for this session.